Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of Rivals Out of Region, the series where we highlight regions from around the globe and tell each of their individual stories. Today we're discussing one of the longest running Rivals of Aether communities in the world, tracing all the way back to the very first day of its early access release. I am Darkbot from Stats of Aether, here to present Rivals Out of Region Oceania. To begin our almost decade-long tale, let's head all the way back to September of 2015. Even before Rivals of Aether had hit its early access release, it had already captured the interest of some of the most notable Smash players in Australia. Having followed the game's development through the Smash Brothers subreddit, these players went on to jumpstart the scene by both hosting and participating in multiple tournaments, with the most notable amongst them being DreadTech and Gabe. In 2015, DreadTech was already a highly celebrated tournament organiser within the Australian Smash and fighting game community. As the president of Couch Warriors, the organisation behind the renowned annual Battle Arena Melbourne series, his endorsement of Rivals of Aether was significant. Armed with an impressive crag, DreadTech's entry onto the scene was nothing short of transformative. Similarly, Gabe was no newcomer to competitive gaming. With a deepening history in both the Melee and Project Melee communities, Gabe had a fundamental grasp of platform fighters that allowed him to dive into Rivals and excel from the outset. The pair would meet in grand finals of the first online tournament held in Australia, an early access release event to mark the creation of the new scene. Although DreadTech emerged victorious, it was the first glimpse of the titans they would soon become, and the legendary status each would go on to obtain. Under DreadTech's lead, a healthy competitive scene would soon develop through the Australian Smash Discord server, the home to the Australian Rivals community to this very day. DreadTech would run weekly online tournaments and hosted the game offline at the Couch Warriors ranking battles in Victoria. Over the next 3 months, each series would hold the very first appearance of some of the most celebrated and long-term players the region would ever see. Many of these players were already highly ranked players in other games and brought fierce competition to the community from the start. But for others like SNC, a Zetterburn player who was in his first year of studies at university, Rivals was the first competitive fighter they had ever picked up. One of the most notable among these players was Splice, a seasoned Smash veteran from Victoria, who was regarded as one of the scene's most formidable Melee players. It was clear to everyone that Splice, along with Gabe and DreadTech, weren't just the region's best, but entirely in a league of their own. This view was reflected within the first release of the National Power Rankings in November of 2015, which awarded them the honour of the S-tier rank, and placed Dave, a Maple-turned-Arcane player, in A-tier as the only player able to come close to competing with them. These rankings would go on to set the stage for the first major regional events in Australian Rivals history. The first bracket, held in New South Wales, was an exemplary grassroots event hosted in the cosy basement of Gabe's grandmother's house. Aptly named Grandma's Basement, this was the tournament that established the rankings for the state's best players, including Carito, Dave, and Lavender, who despite turning in strong performances, could not deny Gabe from taking first place. Just a week later, Melbourne would be host to Miltim 3. Fresh from his win at Grandma's, this event would see Gabe travelling to face off against the Victorian scene for the first time. These two states have always been Australia's strongest, but 3 months into the game, it was impossible to predict how Gabe would fare locally against DreadTech and Splice, or even some of the state's other rising stars like SNC and Neeson, a dedicated Maple player who'd been active almost solely offline so far. Miltim 3 would instead end up being the highlight of Splice's reign. Taking out Neeson, Gabe and DreadTech during his bracket, Splice would prove his in-game tag wasn't just for show. He was an absolute terror to face. Splice ended 2015 as the undisputed #1 player in the country, with some even suggesting he had a chance of claiming the title of best Fosburn in the world at the time. However, the new year would see the scene experience its first big shift. The dominant Splice would almost disappear following Miltim 3, largely due to frustrations with some of the major character redesigns happening during the initial stages of early access. In his absence, the competition in Victoria would grow fierce as both SNC and Neeson were closing in on DreadTech. As for DreadTech himself, he was already starting to move on from the game to focus on other projects, and began mentoring SNC to take over the responsibilities of running both the Couch Warriors Rambats and weekly online events. During this time, Gabe had seen dramatic improvements to his play, and was even gaining some international exposure by sharing his in-game discoveries on the Rivals subreddit in a series of useless tech posts. With him being known as one of Australia's strongest players, it is of no surprise that his contributions would soon see Gabe receive an invite to the Rivals beta team, the first of anyone in the Southern Hemisphere. With the release of Etalus in March of 2016, a series of character swaps would shortly follow. Neeson would drop Maple for the Bear, and a returning Splice would also surprise the scene by swapping his Fosburn for Rasta. Perhaps the most notable swap at the time came from SNC, who traded out his Zetaburn in favour of Crag, taking inspiration from both DreadTech and a handful of combo videos he found online posted by a relatively unknown player who went by only the initials MSB. With the 8th installment of BAM approaching in May, it became apparent that Rivals would not feature in the roster of games for the event. Instead, there would be a Rivals bracket hosted at its companion event, Project Melbourne 2, a PM Shadow Major held in the hopes of avoiding the attention of Nintendo. Although DreadTech had planned to retire from running Rivals by this point, he wanted to make Project Melbourne 2 his swan song event for the game. His efforts would shape this into a premium event, with PM2 being the first true major Rivals tournament in Australia's history. The bracket was evidence that the Victorian scene had steadily been improving, with its high-level play backed up by strong players like Zemestra, Jet and Drizzle in the bracket. This was also the first sign that Ryzul, one of Australia's best Project Melee players, would potentially be a real threat in future events, taking out both Jet and Drizzle before being knocked out by SNC's Crag. Many were wondering whether Splice's return would be enough to prevent Gabe from winning the event. This was convincingly answered when the two met in winners' finals, and a 3-0 win from Gabe would leave Splice feeling utterly defeated, so much so that he would go on to forfeit out of the bracket entirely. This left Neeson, who had suffered a loss against Splice in winners' semis, without a chance for a rematch, earning instead his way into a top 2 placing after eliminating both DreadTech and SNC. Gabe had trained his ABSA for the matchup, but decided to win the event in style, by taking the final game from Neeson in a cheeky Etalus ditto. With some difficult losses at this event, many players found new motivation to push themselves even harder. With DreadTech now officially taking his leave from the community, Neeson and SNC in particular were desperate to close the gap between them and New South Wales' top talent, as Gabe and Dave had proven themselves to be quite the dominant pair in the online tournaments. In Victoria, the local Rambats continued through the year. Splice would leave the scene once again after PM2. In his absence, it was not Neeson but SNC who began a strong win streak in his home state. Neeson would instead spend a lot of time at Character Select, with him swapping mains yet again to learn Rasta after his loss against Splice. Elsewhere, the arrival and rise of both Fel and Callisto occurred, two players who stood out thanks to their skill and general positive attitude towards competing. Fel was a first of two things for the community, being the undisputed best player in New Zealand at the time where there wasn't an active community in the country, as well as being one of the first prominent keyboard players in the region. Callisto would become a dedicated member of the New South Wales community, being known mostly for his extremely friendly demeanour and sense of style. With Neeson trying out new characters and Ryzul not entering many events at the time, Callisto quickly became the best Etalus representative in the region. To close the year, an updated power ranking was released, displaying the shift in power the scene had experienced in the last half of the year of 2016, and readying everyone for what was to come next. To kick off 2017, the community would learn that the next major event to host Rivals would be Expand Gong 2, a New South Wales event being held in early April. The last year didn't offer many opportunities for intense play, and with SNC and Jet each travelling up for the event, it quickly became clear that Expand Gong was going to be something pretty special. This tournament would be the first time SNC and Dave would ever play against each other locally. With their online sets usually going in favour of Dave, it came as quite a shock when SNC walked away with a 3-0 win over the Arcane player. The upsets continued, with Callisto also beating Dave in the loser bracket to secure 3rd place. An incredible result in his first major event. Expand Gong would end with Gabe not only cementing himself as the #1 player in Australia, but also making it seem embarrassingly easy by winning grand finals without even using his main, making this the second major in a row where Gabe would win by playing his opponent's character against them. With the event behind them, the scene would quickly produce a new PR to reflect the huge changes happening in the early 2017 power rankings. Under SNC's direction, the scene would also use this momentum to launch a new weekly tournament called the Aussie Amateurs. The sense of community within Australia had grown immensely, and it wasn't long before the scene began discussing the next big event on the calendar. The Victorian scene was offering up a massive major of their own in mid-May, BAM 9, and this year, the rival scene wouldn't be appearing at some side event. No, this year, they were hanging out with the big boys and getting proper main event treatment. The excitement didn't end there. Just days before the tournament, Australia was announced as the new addition to the Rivals Championship Series on its Season 2 return. The scene was thrilled to be recognised on an international level in this way, soon learning that the winner of the season would eventually be sent over to America to attend the RCS Finals. With BAM 9 being announced as the first tournament in the Australian circuit, the stakes were higher than they had ever been. To truly capture the tension in the community in the lead up to BAM, we're going to need to jump back a few weeks to the second entry in the Aussie Amateurs series. Here we find Ruska, an essentially unknown ABSA player at the time and 7th seed in this 13-entrant bracket. Ruska loses an ABSA Ditto to Intail in Winners Round 2, before quickly adapting to the online competition and managing to take his bracket run right up to a 3rd place finish. A pretty respectable result considering the strengths that the AMI series had quite early on. The following week in Aussie Amateurs 3, Ruska not only wins the event, but does so by taking out Victorian Maple player Osu, someone who had shown great potential in the Ranbats in the first half of the year, and 1 week later would earn himself a spot on the Australia's mid-2017 power rankings. This meant that Ruska, with only 2 weeks of competing, was already showing signs of being a legitimate power ranking level threat. In the following weeks, Ruska would also attend local events in both New South Wales and in the Australian Capital Territory where he resided. He won the first bracket in the ACT with relative ease. It was, after all, a younger scene only just establishing itself. For his first local in New South Wales, he defeated various solid mid-level players such as Saxon and Glace, eventually reaching grand finals against Gabe. This set would result in a 3-0. In favour of Ruska. Gabe would be forced to bring out his Zetterburn to win the event, but the loss of the set still took the community by complete surprise. It was only 1 week later that the unthinkable happened. Ruska becomes the first player in over a year to outplace Gabe at an offline tournament. This ABSA player turned up out of nowhere and beat the best player in the region just 1 week before a huge national event. Something like this is completely unheard of. And that's just what was happening in New South Wales. Over in Victoria, the unexpected appearance of 2 players in the lead up to BAM was also shaking things up. Introducing Jamwa and Splice. That's right, Splice had come back again with his Fosburn, the character that had made him the former champ, and the famous Terror tag came with it. Splice and Jamwa were both longtime veterans in Brawl before both became invested in Melee and Project Melee. Along with grinding out the game with players like Gabe, SNC, Jet and Drizzle, the two elevated each other to the point that either were going to be a legitimate threat at BAM. Despite Jamwa rarely ever competing in Rivals, the community knew his ABSA could compete with the best. The two would test the waters with a small local event held in Melbourne just 1 week before BAM. City of Melee 8 would end with Splice and Jamwa taking 2nd and 3rd respectively, both losing to SNC, but this was enough to get the community talking, as they each took those placements over already established high-level players like Jet, Osu and Drizzle. With results like these in the lead up to the major, BAM 9 was easily one of the most unpredictable tournaments the region would ever see. With the exception of Dave, practically every high-level Rivals player Australia had to offer would be in attendance. The path to top 8 would lead to some upsets. Splice's return saw him narrowly beating Callisto to enter winner's side of top 8, and Jamwa managed to win a close set over Zemestra to earn his own spot on the main stage. Even Ruska, fresh off of multiple wins against Gabe, would enter top 8 from loser's side after taking a loss to Neeson's newly trained Zetterburn. Day 2 would see the surprises continue. Loser's side top 8 had both Ruska and Jamwa bow at 7th place, each suffering from their relative matchup inexperiences. Neeson was given the opportunity to finally rematch Splice after his loss against him at Project Melbourne 2, this time managing a convincing 3-0 win to leave the Terror behind at 4th place. After each took losses against Gabe, Neeson and SNC would clash in losers finals. In a tense back and forth set, Game 5 would see Neeson clutch out a win, making his way into a Grand Finals rematch. The upsets would stop there, with Gabe winning his second major in less than 2 months with barely a scratch on him. RCS would surely see him earn his opportunity to compete in America with a start to the season like this. There was almost no time to take a break following BAM, as the first of the online majors would be held only 2 weeks later. It was at this tournament that the story of RCS Season 2 started to take shape. After a 2-0 loss in winners' quarters against Fells Crag, SNC makes an incredible losers run, taking sets off of Carito, Stutter, Callisto, Neeson, Dave, and then, on top of all of that, double eliminates Gabe in Grand Finals, the first major tournament that SNC had ever taken off of him. SNC would go on to win 3 of the next 4 online majors as well, with Gabe notably not making an appearance at any of these events. With his rise in the RCS leaderboards, SNC would be given the opportunity to enter the Rivals beta team in August of 2017. He would also follow Gabe's lead in writing guides for the Rivals of Ether Academy Discord server, with the pair each contributing to some of the earliest competitive resources available to the scene. The most ambitious of these was the now 87-page document known as SNC's Bago Tricks Crag. Despite not being in a fully updated state, the document commonly referred to as the Crag Bible is still the single most in-depth resource available for the character to this day. September would quickly come around, meaning New South Wales' own major tournament, Oz Hadoop Nationals 15, was right around the corner. This would also be the only Australian event that New Zealand's own Fell would ever travel to. Neeson would swap mains once more to learn the recently released Ori, and with him and Gabe grinding out the matchup in the lead up to Oz Hadoop Nationals, the two were an absolute force to be reckoned with Gabe finding his way to Grand Finals, and Neeson forging a path there himself by taking Losers Finals over SNC. The difficulty of facing such a high-level Ori player left SNC so utterly mentally drained that over the course of the set he eventually swapped to his original main, Zetterburn, for the final game, before conceding the set entirely partway through his second stock. SNC's frustration over the loss, as well as the general state of the game at the time, can clearly be seen in what came to be known as one of Australia's most famous top 3 placement photos. Gabe would continue his streak at local majors by taking out Neeson again, although he did drop the first set of Grand Finals attempting the Ori ditto in classic Gabe fashion. With the remaining online majors taking place September through to December, Australia's first RCS season would eventually reach its end. With Gabe choosing not to enter the majority of the online monthlies throughout, the podium finish would instead find its way to the head TO for the season. SNC was crowned the first Australian RCS champion, receiving an invitation to participate in the RCS finals at Genesis 5. However, SNC wouldn't be the first to represent Australia overseas. Thanks to the generosity of the Rivals of Ether community, Gabe was able to gain funding through the Shine 2017 compendium to travel to North America to compete in both Shine and Super Smash Con. He placed 17th at both events, being eliminated by Canadian Atlas player Lord Bagel at each. But he was able to collect a notable win against a very well-known NA player during Shine, Daniel Fanasi himself. January 2018 came around, and with it Genesis 5. It was SNC's turn to show the world what the Aussies were capable of. With his unfamiliarity of the NA scene, SNC would go on to place 25th in singles after being eliminated by Arizona's Damn Danny. A set where we saw SNC at his absolute best, but showing obvious weaknesses his opponent could take advantage of. SNC would also notably earn a 5th place finish in doubles, partnering with MSB, the very same Crag player who inspired him to learn the character in the first place. The Australian competitors would return home with valuable experiences to share. SNC would focus his efforts on the relatively few resources available in the competitive scene, soon after releasing the first version of Rivals of Ether Academy frame data in March of 2018. This would arguably be SNC's most important contribution to the community, with him solely maintaining and improving it over the years. Following the new year, an updated power ranking was also released, one of the largest Australia would ever publish. With the conclusion of Season 2, the Australia scene would start to stagnate during the off-season in early 2018. Expand Gong would return for its third iteration in the year, seeing Dave win his first major event over both Gabe and Callisto. There however wasn't any interstate presence to be seen this time around, an unfortunate sign that the scene wasn't expanding as expected, and had even started to bleed some of its most talented players. Despite Gabe making appearances at major events, it was clear that he was slowly drifting away from the game, and players such as Splice, Jamwa and Ruska, whose arrival had made such a significant impact at the start of the last RCS season, had essentially disappeared from the community almost entirely. But talent would appear in 2018 from an unexpected place with Pretzel, who hailed from Western Australia, a state that was largely isolated from the rest of the rower community. Pretzel began his time with Rivals by maining Crag, but was captured by the sudden release of Eliana and Sylvanas in April of 2018. He would immediately make the swap to Eliana, and almost overnight, Pretzel became one of the leading community members in terms of labbing the character early into their competitive meta. Thanks to this, Pretzel managed to improve at an incredible rate, making him a legitimate threat at events soon after. This would also start him on a path to eventually become a strong community leader, and alongside his longtime friend RMD, take the initiative to begin developing a new scene in Western Australia's capital city of Perth. RCS would soon return for Season 3, and just like the year before, it would begin with the next iteration of Battle Arena Melbourne. After a disappointing interstate turnout for Expand Gong 3, the New South Wales scene would attend BAM 10 in full force, with this being the only time that Dave would ever travel to Victoria to compete. Pretzel's attendance as the wildcard from the West saw him earn a top 8 placing in his very first Rivals major, with a significant win over Osu, thus marking another shift in the scene. Gabe would face an upset loss against Boy Lips outside of top 8, placing him in losers and outside of Neeson's path. Winners finals would instead see him facing Dave's Orcane, which would surprisingly result in a swift 3-0 in Neeson's favour. Outside of top 8, we would also see Jet manage a surprise win against SNC, forcing the Crag main to play a string of New South Wales players throughout his losers run. This culminated in SNC's first ever win against Gabe at a local event, a feat which had taken him years to achieve, and would see him progress to losers finals, earning a top 3 place. In Gabe's place, it was Dave who would put an end to SNC's bracket, taking the set and earning a chance at a rematch with Neeson. Grand Finals was almost a repeat of their previous set, however, with Neeson sweeping his way through to claim his first major win. With BAM 10 over, the new season was suddenly in motion. In Victoria, the competition was becoming quite fierce, with Jet's win against SNC being just the beginning. High-level players like Jet and Osu, along with a young Zetterman player under the tag Mast, were each closing in on the gap between them and the Victoria powerhouses that Neeson and SNC had been for almost 3 years. Competitive players in New South Wales were cultivating a healthy local scene by inspiring talent, such as Mata and Katsune, with Mata gaining attention for their technically impressive Clarin and Katsune for their Ori, on top of going on to become a prominent tournament organizer for the region in the upcoming seasons. This new wave of offline players in New South Wales were almost left without a big event to look forwards to, however, with Ozhadou closing their doors in 2018 and leaving a gap in the schedule for a new potential major series to take its place. At the time, Star, Australia's head TO for Project Melee, had a series of PM and Smash 64 locals under the name of Metal Cavern. Having last hosted Rivals in the very first online bracket all the way back in 2015, Star would now approach SNC to discuss running a new major focused on Australia's PM and Rivals communities. This would result in the creation of Mega Metal Cavern, a major which aimed to celebrate the games which wouldn't normally get the spotlight. The first Mega Metal Cavern would be a huge success within the community, with many from the Victoria scene travelling up for its Rivals bracket. Pretzel would also return for his second major of the year, finding himself another 7th place finish for the Western Australia scene. The most impressive result, however, came from the 16-year-old Mast, taking out 2 of the best players in the country in back-to-back sets, suddenly placing him in winner's side of Grand Finals. With both Neeson and SNC now playing from losers, it was inevitable they would face in losers finals, making it an all-Victorian top 3 for Mega Metal Cavern's premier event. Despite playing from behind, Neeson once again again found his way in front with a new character, his Rano, clawing its way past both SNC and then Mast to win the tournament. The online Season 3 majors had been a constant back and forth between Neeson and SNC for the top spot in the leaderboard. But with Neeson now winning his second major in a row, his status as the best in Australia had been thoroughly established. Neeson would be Australia's RCS Season 3 champion. Receiving the invitation to participate in Genesis 6, Neeson would become the next Australian to fight on the world stage. Unfortunately, the growing roster created noticeable gaps within the region's matchup knowledge. Neeson provided the scene with a strong Rano player to learn from, but without there being another Rano of the same caliber within the community, Neeson was left unprepared for the ditto when facing Dank Ramen Boy in his losers bracket, ultimately getting knocked out at 33rd. Challenges like these were only widening the gap between each region's skill. 2018 would close with a new, bittersweet power ranking, as it would be the last one for Neeson. Having achieved his goals with the game, he decided that Genesis 6 felt like the natural endpoint for his career. Notably, by this point, Dave had also slowed down on the game, and with Gabe also retiring as a competitor, the year would end with Australia having lost 3 of its most experienced players. With some of the most experienced and long-term players having moved on from the game, 2019 was a turning point for the region's history. The community was thankfully able to maintain some level of momentum, with weekly events still ongoing and the amateur series still fostering new talent. It is during this period that many of the region's current top players and community leaders would first appear. BAM 11 would arrive a little too early to be a part of the RCS season this year, but it would serve as the perfect tournament to establish the region's current top players. Semestra was able to finally earn the top 8 BAM placing that they had been aiming for over the past 2 years. And relative newcomer to the scene, Conga Heli, would have a breakout performance with their Eliana, eliminating Australia's former champ Gabe in his first set of top 8. New South Wales would offer one more talented player to the event. Having been a consistent player at locals for many years, Glace would make the trip over with the help of funding from SNC. With his Etalus, Glace would go on to roll through the bracket, earning wins over Gabe, Osu and Conga Heli before reaching winners semis against SNC. Although being double eliminated by SNC at the event, Glace's bracket wouldn't end without him somehow managing one further upset, beating Jet in losers semis to earn himself a 3rd place finish to the tournament. On the Victorian side, Mast picked up from where Mega Metal Cavern had left off, reaching winners side finals after once again defeating SNC in a close Game 5 set. History would unfortunately repeat itself, however, with SNC coming back to narrowly defeat him over the course of a 9-game grand finals. Season 4 of RCS would begin soon after, and with a completely new structure. More emphasis would be placed on offline tournaments this time around, with events from a much wider range of regions. Perth would see the first of these, with Big Win Championship 2 offering the first Rivals major to be held in Western Australia. This was but a humble bracket with 11 entrants and notably without Pretzel in attendance, but it did serve as part of the foundation of the still developing Perth scene. With their major events delayed until later in the season, Victoria and New South Wales would see their local tournaments added to the first half of the RCS calendar. Continuing through the Metal Cavern series, New South Wales had unfortunately lost a lot of the talent they once had over the previous year. Fortunately, the scene had Katsuna running events for the dedicated few that remained. Victoria, on the other hand, was seeing a resurgence in activity following BAM. They began to form an incredibly tight-knit group within the Couch Warriors Rambats, with players like Rendered Spy, Cherry, Random 7 Flame, Mellotech, and Ludovision all adding to an already strong core group of players. The ongoing tradition amongst the group was to head out for an HSP after each tournament, which is where some of the scene's best post-game analysis would occur. Across the sea, Biggie 2 took place in the very early stages of a newly forming New Zealand scene. Many would point to this event as the first time that the New Zealand Smash community really embraced Rivals. Fel, the longtime keyboard warrior, would unsurprisingly take the top spot, although he did find himself with some competition in Jarcino, one of the few other players in this event who had experience competing against the Australian scene. Mega Metal Cavern would then return for its second entry in November of 2019. All of New South Wales' best were in attendance, and the Victorian scene found representation in SNC and OSU, as well as Random 7 Flame. The fresh wave of players found themselves competing against their interstate counterparts for the first time here, and the friendly rivalries that had formed would help Mega Metal Cavern 2 maintain the strong sense of community that had made it a hit in the previous year. The tournament would also have a breakout performance of its own to rival Glace's recent run at BAM. Raizul, a player who we last checked in on at Project Melbourne 2 all the way back in 2016, had been playing Ori ever since their release. Although he was also in attendance for a number of events we've already discussed, his results so far were with him rarely touching the game. With him being one of the best Project Melee players in the country, even the smallest amount of dedicated Rivals practice could be enough to see him cause some major upsets. With that in mind, it was almost predictable that Raizul would double eliminate Callisto and eventually take down Osu's Maple in his path to Losers Side Grand Finals. At this point, there was even genuine uncertainty over whether SNC could take him down. With a score of 3-1, Mega Metal Cavern 2 would go the way of the Crag main in the end, earning SNC his second major win of the year. It was clear that Raizul was starting to adapt to SNC's tricks over the course of their set, however, which proved relevant coming into the final major event of the year. Closing out the RCS season, Couch Warriors Cross Up 2 was held a month later in Victoria. There were some significant upsets at this event. Jet losing to both Zemestra and Konga Heli saw him placing 5th, for example. But the most notable by far was that Raizul took the lessons learned from Mega Metal Cavern 2 and applied them with confidence, double eliminating SNC to win the tournament over him, a feat that only Jet had managed to achieve over the entirety of 2019. In spite of this, Raizul's feat would not prevent SNC from maintaining the first place in the RCS Season 4 leaderboard, and for the second time, he would be crowned the Australian RCS champion. Having already taken the opportunity to compete in America in the past, to the surprise of many, SNC would eventually decide to pass up the opportunity to attend the NA Finals event, Genesis 7, onto the second place finalist for the season. Jet had been trailing behind SNC all season. Although the final 2 events of the season saw Osu in attendance at both Mega Metal Cavern 2 and Couch Warriors Cross Up 2, netting him 2 third-place finishes in the process. With Jet underperforming in the last event of the year, the leaderboard changed dramatically, ending with Osu just narrowly in front and earning his chance to compete overseas. 2020 would begin, and with the full support of the Australian scene, Osu would go on to attend Genesis 7. After a hard-fought bracket losing to both Blair and Primetime, he would eventually return with a 25th place finish. Back home, the Rivals scene was still recovering from a long RCS season. The Australian Smash community, on the other hand, were only just hitting their stride, with New South Wales being host to Phantom 2020, a premium event which had even attracted international talent in attendance. Katsune would be offered an opportunity to TO a Rivals side bracket, giving the New South Wales scene some proper stakes quite early into the year. This event would see the likes of Jarcino, Glace, Obscurity and Katsune all in competition, but the real story is that Mast, for the third time in his career, would be denied the win at a major yet again. Raizul, still fresh off of his victory at Couch Warriors Cross Up 2, would prove too strong for the sole Victorian in attendance. Phantom 2020 would be the last major tournament in Australia before the world was wrapped in a global pandemic. Local events would halt in a number of states in Australia, with Victoria and New South Wales experiencing some of the longest lockdowns in the world. The pandemic hit hard enough that local events haven't bounced back for this part of the Rivals community, forcing the scene to go almost solely online, with the exception of a few major hosted events to this day. The transition began in part due to the introduction of a new official competitive season, the Rivals Online Championship Series, a season composed of solely online majors held bi-weekly from April to July. This would be a season marked by the SNC vs Jet rivalry, and while SNC was able to get ahead in most events over the course of the season, it was Jet that would take out the win in the ROCS finals. Now approaching the release of Rivals Definitive Edition, Gabe makes an unexpected contribution to the Australian community with his smaller scale power ranking, released in the hopes of immortalising the scene's highest level players ahead of what the community expected to be an influx of new players. With the next season of RCS approaching, perhaps the biggest development during this time was SNC's retirement from his duties as head TO for the region. Since taking over the weeklies from DreadTech back in January of 2016, SNC had been responsible for delivering 3 full seasons of RCS, some of the country's largest major events, and only recently the Juggernaut, which was the fortnightly ROCS season. The shift in leadership was something the community had already been preparing for. Osu had been a long-time co-TO for Victoria, and with Katsune taking up the mantle of head TO for the next 2 seasons of RCS, the season would be left in good hands. September ushered the arrival of the Definitive Edition update, along with the Switch port of the game. A number of players, both returning and new, would find their way to the Australian Smash Discord server to take part in the next era of the scene's history. This was the second chance for the Oceania community to really flourish. Season 5 of RCS would offer an immediate testing ground for the now renewed scene, boasting some of the largest attendance records Oceania had ever seen. While SNC and Jet would each take out wins during the season, the opening event in the Fire Major is perhaps the most notable due to its surprise victor. With the New Zealand scene starting to pick up again, its longest serving player returned with a reckoning. Fel would go on to double eliminate Jet in grand finals for his best ever tournament placing. The January 2021 Season 5 finals would be a pivotal moment for the community. SNC would take the honours in both singles and doubles, with his grand final set against Jet being one of the best showcases between the pair all season. The most significant development, however, was the Arcadian bracket added to the event. Under the leadership of Katsune, this would be the first amateur-style event that the region had seen in more than a full year, offering an opportunity for the Oceania community to celebrate their developing players. Surprisingly, it would be a post-Definitive Edition era player who would take the top spot here, the keyboard Sylvanos player going by the tag of Xenix. The Arcadian wasn't the only development Katsune would bring during this time. Since the very start of its history, Australia had played on competitive stage lists unlike any other in the world. The pandemic-forced transition to predominantly online play in 2020 moved the community to change the starter stages in 2021 for the last time. The Australian stage list was made to match the in-game starters and counterpicks with one notable exception, Tempest Peak. Australia is the only region in the world that has banned Tempest Peak throughout the majority of its competitive history, and the ban was maintained with the new stage list, meaning that Tempest Peak remains locked off for competitive play to this day. After the boost in activity through Season 5 of RCS, the absence of local tournament experiences was starting to be felt in Victoria. To lead their return, Rendered Spy and Cherry would each host tournaments in their own homes during late 2020 into 2021. The Espionage series of tournaments run by Rendered would become an eagerly awaited seasonal event that would lead the community to rekindle the strong bonds it had in previous years. Players were improving quickly thanks to the new events on offer, and thus, a new unofficial power ranking would be released in early 2021, the Katsune 20, documenting the top 20 players in the scene and providing a much more comprehensive look at how Australia had developed over the last year. The country firmly remained crag territory thanks to the recent addition of Hammerhead, Todizzle, and Hamman. But the most dramatic entry into the rankings came from Xenix, being in the scene for only 6 months and already being considered the 8th best in the region. Meanwhile, the scene was witnessing the rebirth of New Zealand rivals. Biggie 3 offered a 45-person bracket in February of 2021, but despite its grand scale, it would have its top players duke it out on a humble laptop setup. This was a small price to pay to allow the longtime keyboard player Fel the ability to compete against the new wave of players, a kind gesture that would provide Fel with a triumphant swan song, as his win at Biggie 3 would be the last time he would attend a major tournament. His skills did leave quite the impression, with the scene eager to push the competition in New Zealand even further. A chance came 2 months later with the city of Christchurch hosting Southern Stronghold 2021 with another whopping 40 entrant rivals bracket. Now fully on the Switch and without Fel present, this event would see Eggtime, the second place finalist from Biggie 3, carve out his place ahead of the rest of the pack. It wouldn't take long before we would see Eggtime conquer another victory. Crush Counter Capital in July of 2021 offered strong competition in players such as IDK, ICK and Sky, but none able to prevent Eggtime and his Ethelas claiming the title of the new best in New Zealand. In response to New Zealand expanding during this time, Season 6 of RCS would see a rebranding from RCS Australia to RCS Oceania, welcoming the New Zealand scene officially into the fray. Competition between Jet and SNC would continue throughout the season, but things would receive a bit of a shake-up this time around with the return of Gabe. The scene's former best almost picked up where he'd left off, winning 2 out of the 4 events in the regular season. The competition had changed drastically since Gabe's reign, however, and despite him proving to be a real threat going into the season's finals, the event would ultimately go the way of Jet, who after many years of fighting alongside SNC for the crown, was finally and inarguably defined as the region's best player. Alongside Season 6 of RCS, there was another competitive league which had captured the attention of the Oceania scene. After the success of the Arcadian bracket held in the RCS Season 5 finals earlier in 2021, two players would begin work on a new tournament series targeted towards the developing players of the region. The Rivals Oceanic Amateur Championship Series would begin in October of 2021 under the careful charge of both Gemic and Rendered Spy. Consisting of 8 qualifying events over the course of 6 months, the winners of each would be allowed entry into a final online invitational at the end of the season. In the lead up to the season's final event, Rendered Spy would arrange for interviews with each of the finalists, allowing the community to learn more about each of the players and their backgrounds. Whilst Cherry was the initial favourite to take the win following his improvements in the Victorian scene, a crag player from New South Wales by the tag of Red Chains would end up victorious in dominant fashion. The first AMI season would be a roaring success, all but guaranteeing a return later in the year. Following Crush Counter Capital, another of New Zealand's players had also taken their first steps towards becoming a notable TO. Through collaborations with the Rivals of Asia Discord server, Lichko and a small team would host a number of cross-regional brackets online, strengthening the relationship between the two communities. This was made possible through the release of rollback netcode to the game in early 2022, which also saw the release of 4 brand new characters that originated from the Steam Community Workshop. Whilst Oceania has many notable players representing the Workshop pack currently, the most notable to make the swap in the early days was Victoria's own Osu, who had been a Maple player almost exclusively since 2016, but will go on to try his hand at Solo Pom for the future events. 2022 would also see the return of major events in Australia for the first time since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, with BAM making a comeback after a 3-year-long hiatus. With Katsune moving away from the Rivals community to focus on other interests, Rendered Spy would be the one to step up and take the head TO mantle along with the responsibility of hosting this event. Many of Australia's top players were in attendance for BAM, but notably absent was the recently returned Gabe. Following his PhD, the now Dr. Gabe was able to find an employment opportunity in America which would see him leaving Australia in the mid-2022. He has since been seen at a number of major events in NA, representing the Australian scene where he can. In the lead up to BAM, SNC had chosen to focus his efforts on updating and maintaining the community's frame data resources rather than competing, leaving Jet as the firm favourite to win. However, having been so long since everyone had attended any major offline events, the outcome was far from assured. Despite this, SNC being knocked out of the bracket at 7th would be a huge shock for the scene, with him collecting first-time losses against both Rendered Spy and Random 7 Flame. This would set Rendered's Ori on a path to losers finals, with him pocketing wins against both Red Chains and Hamman, the only other crags in attendance. Unfortunately for Rendered, Osu had also shown signs of greatness in his top 8. With his recently trained Pom, Osu would take out the win and move on to face Jet in Grand Finals. Over 2 tightly contested sets, it would come down to the very last hit. Incredibly, Osu would earn not only the title of the BAM 12 champion, but would also be the first person in the world to win a major Rivals tournament with Pom. This was the beginning of a huge burst of activity in Oceania. July would see the return of New Zealand's Crush Counter Capital, now with a full year of growth in their Rivals scene. Fish Game would offer a strong hoedown in top 8, and Christchurch's Solas, Lichko, and Physic would each earn high placements in the bracket. It was, however, an invader to the scene that would take home the gold. Following his career best performance at BAM 12, Rendered Spy would travel in from Australia to clean up the New Zealand scene with his years of experience. This was only the first stop for Rendered Spy, with July also seeing the New South Wales community once again hosting Mega Metal Cavern. The Victorian scene would have a huge turnout for this event, with Jet here for another shot at glory, as well as many of the state's rising stars attending their first ever interstate event, as well as SNC there to run the show for one final time. Hamman would have his breakout performance with his crag, defeating the likes of Glace, Red Chains, Conga Heli and Rendered Spy, to ultimately find his way into grand finals from loser's side. Even so, this was Jet's tournament to win, and after so many years of being in contention for the best in the country, he would finally earn his first and only win at an offline major. With such a flurry of activity in the span of only 3 months, the community slowed down in the time thereafter. RCS Season 7 would once again change its format, with Oceania being swallowed into the umbrella of world events and no longer featuring specifically organised tournaments for the region to attend. Lichko would initially offer a new series of tournaments during this time for both Oceania and Asia, titled Pacific Gladiators, but would eventually turn his focus towards his growing passion for the traditional fighters community instead. Western Australia would also offer up an entry of its own for the RCS, the rivals Rampage, introducing a new prominent TO in RMD, with many of the scene's veteran players such as SNC, Jet and Osu taking a well-needed break from the game. This bracket and its sequel event, Aether Rampage, would see the new wave of players taking centre stage, with Xenix and Hamman representing the highest level of play in Australia at the time. During this time, Rivals Oceania Amateurs Championship Series was instead the primary focus of the scene. The skill on display each season would far exceed the standard shown in the ones prior, with the Amateurs League now laying down the foundation of some of Oceania's most promising players. October 2022 would see a Shovel Knight main in the spotlight, with Bat winning the Amateurs Season 2 Invitational over one of the region's most technical players, a Claren by the tag of Superdot. Each player had been progressively improving since starting in 2021 and are now actively competing for some of the top spots in Australia. While Season 3 of the Amateurs Series has only recently concluded, its winner, Coach Hot Wheels, is one to look out for in the future, with him being a consistent threat in the online weeklies that continue to this day. For the rest of the Australian community, the only real source of competition came from the weekly online tournaments, with RMD and Pretzel using the Western Australia Discord server as a second hub for the Oceania region. For one player, these tournaments have offered a chance to cement their place in the scene, with Xenix remaining an elusive online warrior to this day. Despite not ever being seen as a local, most in the community would agree that he is the clear best player in the region in 2023. Players in New Zealand, on the other hand, have continued to host regular offline events, like the recent major held in Wellington under the name Second Win. Egg Time would once again take first place here, although he was met with some competition in Physics Fosburn this time around, with this pair of players currently holding a strong dominance in the region. There was one more major tournament that would capture the community during this time that needs to be highlighted, and that is BAM 13. Held in early June of 2023, this was the culmination of every era of Australian Rivals history coming together for one huge event. Rendered Spy would return to TO their second BAM, and SNC and Pretzel would be in attendance to represent the old school players. Pretzel would even net himself a strong third place finish thanks to an earlier upset against Conga Heli, but it would be the more recent crop of players who would stand out at this event. The top two placing players from Season 2 of AMI's league, Bat and Superdot, would each have some of their best ever tournament performances, with Bat managing an impressive storm through the entire top 8 losers side into grand finals. Here, Bat would find himself against more experienced hands, with Hamman's Crag making its second appearance in the final set of the major. The stress of the set was evident in both players throughout, with a bracket reset raising the stakes dramatically after Game 4. After 6 straight set wins in the losers side of bracket, Bat could no longer hold his nerves, and Hamman would narrowly take the win and claim the title of BAM champion for Victoria once more. The ripples of this event were felt throughout the rest of 2023, with Rendered Spy offering a new battleground for high-level play with the Online Rivals Championship in ANZ, otherwise known as Orca. It shared the same format as the ROAX Amateur League, with 8 qualifier tournaments leading into a season final scheduled for early November. This was the premium event to win for players who wished to cement their ranking within the scene. The Orca finals saw a diverse representation with players from the ROAX Amateur League, a returning veteran in SNC, and 3 of New Zealand's strongest players from Christchurch. Xenix met everyone's expectations by conquering the top spot in the league, showing how Orca was yet another opportunity to prove his dominance over the recent years. What came as a shocking surprise was to see how strongly Australia had remained firm Crag territory, boasting 3 Crag mains in Hamman, SNC and Red Chains in the remainder of the top 4. With Orca concluded and after 2 years of running multiple events, Rendered Spy would announce a deserved hiatus from his TO duties. The scene too is readying itself for a short break after a heated year, preparing for what may come next. This is where the community stands today. With its 8 years of history still being written, the Oceania scene is one which will certainly survive the test of time. To close out, I get to talk to you as myself, mainly because I want to encourage anyone on the fence about trying the game to hop on and give it a go. As you've hopefully seen from this video, the Rivals community has plenty of exciting competition, along with an eclectic range of players all on their unique journeys to conquering top spots. But beyond that, it is a wonderfully welcoming and empowering group of individuals from all walks of life who just want to have fun together. If I had any advice to give anyone thinking of joining Rivals, it would be to not worry about the skill gap between yourself and the community when you start. Many of the experienced players I've encountered along the way have been eager to help new players skill up and join the fray. What's more, competing isn't the only side to the game and scene. There are plenty of fun modes and events, as well as opportunities to chill out with members of the community and find the spot that fits you. We've reached the end of our time together. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, go ahead, click the like button. Consider subscribing and toggle the bell so you won't miss any new videos. Once again, I am Darkbot from Stats of Ether. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you online.